I will just quickly introduce our speakers for today. So I've got with me today David Hadipe, the Senior Specialist Scientist with SEPA, and Emma Bruce, the Lead Specialist for Inland Flooding, both of which have led in the development of the new maps. I'm also joined by Claire Wheeler, the Principal Policy Officer, and Elaine Fothering, the Senior Planning Officer, both of whom lead in flooding advice and provided advice to land use mapping as well.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction, Trevor. I think between the four of us this afternoon, we want to kind of give you a bit of a feel for our new surface water and small watercourses flood maps, how they're developed, some of the background to that, and some of the kind of planning and policy implications of that. So I guess by way of kind of kicking us off, then SEPA's had flood maps for quite a long time. They kind of dates back to the kind of the mid-90s when we had what was then known as the In-Chute Hydrology 130 map, and these were just for river flooding, and that's something used by SEPA staff to provide advice into the land use planning system. We kind of come forwards a decade into November 2006 and the release of the indicative river and coastal flood maps. So these are the first publicly available flood maps for Scotland, and some of you on the call may have used them in your decision making in years past. And this was the first time we had river and coastal flood maps, and they're very much driven from a need to provide information for planning. So they're designed for planning purposes. A 200-year flood event was published, but available to partners was also a 100-year and a 1,000-year flood event as well. And those maps saw a number of updates, mostly to the river part of them. And it wasn't until really 2013 when we kind of released our next generation of flood maps, which is what we have today. And this was very much driven by the requirements of the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act, which came out in 2009. And that mandated a whole new range of information that we needed to create around flood hazard maps. So multiple scenarios of flooding, a greater range of information, so things like the depth of flooding, the extent of flooding, the speed of flooding. And this saw us releasing the first publicly available surface water flood maps alongside brand new river and coastal flood maps, and they've been publicly available since January 2014. And we're on seven releases of that dataset so far, including the ones that have most recently been published in March. And they've gone through a number of iterations themselves. Probably the most significant of those is the future flood maps that we released in November 2020. So these are the first time that we had publicly available flood maps that show how climate change could alter future flood hazard for river and coastal flooding only. Our latest release, which is I guess what we're going to talk to you today about, is our surface water and small watercourses flood maps, which were released last month. Now, these maps haven't stayed static whilst they were released mainly in 2013, or January 2014 even. We've seen several hundred updates over that time. The main focus of those has been to our fluvial maps. And this largely drew on kind of updates and projects undertaken by both SEPA and local authorities to meet the requirements of the first cycle of the Flood Risk Management Scotland Act. Whilst this has been the bulk of our updates and haven't actually been any new fluvial updates since November of 2020, we are scoping about what the future of these maps looks like at the moment. Our coastal maps have seen less updates since January 2014, but we've been doing a lot of work in the background on the building blocks for developing these further. So working with the other environment agencies on developing design sea level data sets, looking at how we can best represent wind and wave conditions offshore. And we're now focused on delivering regional scale map updates, and we've done 2 of those so far. One for North East Scotland, so John O'Groats down to Montrose, including Orkney, and also the Outer Hebrides. And we're in the middle of delivering the 3rd one of those big regional scale contracts, which has taken us from Montrose to Berwick upon Tweed. And that data is currently being reviewed by local authorities and SEPA at the moment. Our surface water updates have seen relatively few, and in fact there's been no updates until the other month since 2015, and that's because there's been a number of changes going on, and my colleague Em will talk a bit more to those shortly. In terms of kind of accessing all this data, then we've always displayed a reasonable amount of our information online on the SEPA website for people to view in a range of different map viewers. But I think it'd be fair to say that it's been quite difficult for us to make that information more widely available for people to download and ingest into their own systems. And that's largely due to kind of data licensing. So until relatively recently, then we've kind of had to restrict who could use our data to beyond the website to partner organizations, those with flood risk management, civil contingencies responsibility. And this was all done under license, quite restrictive licenses actually, with some sub-licensing ability for partners, contractors. But we've been on a journey because we recognize that actually our flooding information is really useful for others to make decisions. And over a course of about 6 years, we've kind of renegotiated some of our licenses to basically make some of our data more freely available. So we're now at a point where actually we have a number of open data sets. It started with our flood hazard maps and now covers flood maps, some of the information used to support decision making in the flood risk management space, and also some of our information about where we provide flood warnings and the like. And this is very much a journey. So as we're developing new products, we're looking at, can they be made available more openly? Are there new ways that we can provide them as, say, GIS sensors and the like? So today, if you need to use the SEPA flood maps, then you can look on our website. Ooh, something's disappeared there. Oh, there we go. You can look on our website on one of our many viewers. You can download the data from our publication page. And we're also at the early stages of beta trialing map services, so you can ingest the data straight into GIS platforms without the need to download information. We're also shortly going to be releasing, and this is a wider SEPA piece of work, our open data hub. And so this is basically about providing the ability to access our data freely, much easier to use than our current data publication pages. And this will be free to use. It's going to be in a public beta for people to have a play around with, and also run alongside a current environmental data page. So I'll give that ability to search for SEPA data. You can explore it in map viewers without needing to download it first. You can download it if you want to. You can access it through various APIs as well. So look for that coming soon. I know that perhaps some people on organizations on the call have supported the private beta of that, but do look out for that coming. And I'm going to hand over now to my colleague Emma, who's going to talk a bit more about the surface water maps themselves.
Yep, afternoon everyone. My name is Emma Bruce. I'm our lead specialist in SEPA for inland flooding, and I've been the sort of overall project lead on our new surface water and small watercourse hazard maps for the last couple of years, working extremely closely with David, who's been involved for considerably longer than that as the technical lead on the project. So I'll provide you all with a bit more information now on this latest update we've made to the maps just a few weeks ago on the 12th of March, when we published those new national surface water and small watercourse flood hazard maps. That publication milestone marks the end of a multi-year contract that's been ongoing since roughly 2020, with our working really closely and collaboratively with JBA Consulting to deliver these maps. I'll provide a little bit of background to the drivers for the new maps. I'll explore the methodology and the data a little bit further, all the while showcasing some examples of how the maps compare with our previous maps and show these improvements that we've made to our understanding of the hazard from these sources. All of this is to try and help us deliver enhanced understanding, better information, support better decision making, and increase our resilience to the challenges of flooding and climate change. So why new flood maps? I think it's David's taken us on a journey there of where we've been with our previous generations of maps and where we've made updates. And it's fair to say there had been a lengthy period between when we last published surface water information when they were first published back in 2014. That's a long time. There's been significant improvements since then, either to data sets, methodologies, technologies. It's a long time, so it was time to make a change. There has been a significant change and improvements to our design rainfall estimates for the UK over that period. Most recently, actually, during the development of these maps. We've got now sort of 25 to 30 years more rainfall observations available. And in Scotland, there's significant increases to our representation in that design rainfall data set, especially for short duration, high frequency flood events. And that's often those associated with this kind of flooding from surface water and small watercourses. So FEH22 is the data set that we are using in our new maps. And that's from a big improvement from where we were before. We've also got access now to much more information on, let me just keep up with my slides, much more ground model information. There's a significant amount now of an increase in LiDAR coverage, particularly across the Central Belt area. You can see with the image on the screen just now the difference between back in 2012 when we had LiDAR, or where we had LiDAR rather, compared to around about 2021 when the data was starting to be used in the maps. There's a significant increase in that higher quality information, and that is so fundamental to our ability to make as accurate as possible mapping and modelling. I think I managed to scooch over a slide somewhere there somehow around climate change data. We've also got a lot of more access to UKCP 09 data, UKCP 18 data in our new flood maps. So I'll talk a little bit about how we've represented climate change in the maps later on. So for a project like this, I think it's fair to say that representing Scotland nationally in a model is a fairly challenging process, and we have revised every aspect of the modelling chain, and this is to try. So yes, a challenge to represent Scotland in a model, but we've done so across the whole modelling chain to try and use that latest data and science as far as possible within our ability to, or within our modelling and mapping. We had some key principles within our methodology that we're trying to achieve in this project. We wanted a nationally consistent modelling framework. We currently have our previous generation of surface water maps had a real combination of local modelling, regional modelling, national modelling. It's a bit of a patchwork of different modelling approaches in there, but we wanted to have a fully consistent national approach. So that was an underpinning principle of our project. We wanted to also adopt a fully 2D modelling approach, and to achieve this we used software with JBA consulting called JFlow, and that solves what we needed to solve from a numerical perspective, the shallow water equations, and that enables us to provide this level of modelling and mapping in a fully 2D way nationally. We also wanted to increase the resolution of our mapping. Our previous maps were around a 5 metre grid resolution. The new maps, they have taken a step forward and they are now a 2 metre resolution. So they were some of our key principles that really underpinned all of our design of our methodology. But you can see here there's a huge amount that goes into a methodology for a project such like this and a product such as this. Everything from our hydrology, which I've briefly touched on with our FEH22 dataset and that new and better information. We've looked at what assumptions we've made within our modelling when things are lost from the map. So when we talk about losses, we mean when that rainfall falls, how much can we expect to be naturally consumed by either the land or the drainage systems on the ground. We've looked at climate change and brought in that UKCP 18 information, and produced for the first time a future flood map for surface water and small watercourses. Our land cover, our roads, our building representation, our ground models, the boundary conditions that we apply, our catchments. There's been a huge effort to define the methodology that's went into this, and I'll talk you through some of those aspects in a little bit more detail now. So I briefly touched earlier on that increase in LiDAR coverage, and that's really, really fundamental to our ability to produce modelling like this. So our digital terrain model has been significantly improved. That underpins all of our mapping and modelling here. We're using LiDAR and prioritising the use of newest data sets whenever we had them available at the time of the modelling, and that's a really big improvement to where we are, to where we were previously. Buildings are also much better represented now. They're in the digital landscape, so we've got a much clearer understanding of the land, and for a type of surface water modelling and mapping, that's just fundamentally important to be able to represent and understand those mechanisms with the best data possible. Our rainfall data, if our ground model information isn't important, then I think it's fair to say our rainfall information driving the maps is of huge importance. So we've used those latest rainfall estimates from the FEH 22, that's the Flood Estimation Handbook 22. We've also changed from a blanket assumption that we made in previous versions of the maps, where we just looked at a single storm duration. We've looked in this project at multiple storm durations. We've looked at the 1 hour duration storm, a 6 and a 12 hour. So we've tripled our amount of work at that front at least. And then we've processed all of that information once we have the results into something known as a post-processed storm mosaic. So what that means is we did all of this modelling for different durations, identified in every cell what the worst sort of case scenario was, where the critical duration was for that location, and merged them together. So we've got a much more comprehensive and detailed understanding actually of surface water flooding, taking account different conditions and different duration events. We've done this for 9 different present day rainfall scenarios. So we have modelled from the 2-year annual event, annual exceedance probability, the 2-year return period, all the way up to the 1,000-year and even the 10,000-year event in this case. So we've modelled a whole range of scenarios. We haven't published all of those. Our published scenarios are our high and our medium, our low, and our future flood map. But we've got a huge amount of modelling that's went in. I mean, you do all of those scenarios, each with 3 different storm durations, work it all together. I think you can start to get a feel for just how much modelling and processing has went in to get us to this point with the maps. And here's my slide on climate change that I thought I'd managed to lose earlier. And we have now got, for the first time, I've said, a future flood map for surface water and small watercourses, and that's brilliant. And that brings in information from the UKCP 18 climate change projections. That research was based on a project known as Future Drainage. It calculates rainfall uplifts on a catchment or river basin region, I should say. And these uplifts can vary by storm duration, by return period. And we've modelled 8 different future climate scenarios. Again, we're publishing one, and I'll show you an example of that later on. But we've looked at different combinations of climate change scenarios, largely focused or entirely focused on our 30-year and our 200-year return period events. We've looked at central and high estimates for the 2070s time horizon. And these are all based on Representative Concentration Pathway 8.5 or RCP 8.5, if you're familiar with that. There's been lots of other improvements as well as to the data that's into the modelling, the actual how we've undertaken the modelling and got the best information out of it. We've done a lot of methodological improvements too, and this is an example of one of them. So we have removed sort of fluvial influence that we were previously seeing exerted on our hazard maps before. So we've taken something called the drainage sump that helps us to remove water when our small water courses and our surface water, when they interact with rivers with a catchment greater than 10 kilometres squared. So that helps us really disaggregate the potential overlap and double counting that happens when you've got surface water and river flooding, and that'll be really beneficial, I hope, to get a bit of a truer understanding of what's at risk from each source. And just to show a couple of examples, which I'll be popping through the slides, this example just shows on the left with our previous maps and on the right our new maps. It's very zoomed out, and I hope you'll all have had much opportunity and will have opportunities to use the maps yourselves and get a bit more hands-on. But in this particular example, the difference between that fluvial sump approach being applied, it helps to delineate much clearer surface water flood extents, which is great. We've also improved our structure representation in the new maps. So we've got around about 51,000 structures incorporated in the maps. They've been sourced from information from local and national data sets and databases and information that's been provided by partner organisations like yourselves. You definitely will not have every structure represented in there nationally, and certainly not with the correct dimensions in every location, but there's been a huge effort to try and get as much information on important structures and those that influence flow pathways and flow mechanisms to capture those in the modelling, so that our extents are as accurate as we can make them. So we've got culverts in there where we need them. We've also got walls. We've got other structures in there, bridges and pathways, but we don't have generally represented in there our walls and flood defences. It's not really appropriate for this scale of national modelling, but where we've got important structures influencing flow mechanisms, we've looked to incorporate those. We have also supplemented much of this information with aerial or street level imagery where dimensional information wasn't available. So we've made every effort to try and capture these structures where they're important as accurately as we can hope to. And again, just a wee example here of a location. It's probably very hard to see on the screen, but there's yellow circles showing various structures that we've incorporated in the maps, and they are showing the change that just incorporating those structures in can make. So less artificial backing up at the entrance to structures, less flow becoming trapped because there's a structure that we're not representing in our maps that exists on the ground that would allow the water to move in a different way. So again, another significant improvement to our maps. Land use, really important as well, to allow us to be confident in how our modelling is behaving. Been a bit of a desire to move away from previous kind of high level assumptions that were very, very high level and simplistic. Things were urban or rural. We've now got a much higher resolution number of classes of information available to us within our modelling. So we've used OS master map and other data sets to try and help us define what the land cover is on the ground. Now, that whether that's man-made or natural, you can see that the kind of increased granularity we can get from the data that's now available to us allows us to much better delineate between gardens, roads, areas of green space, buildings, these things that are all extremely important to how the water will interact with on the ground. Get two broad overall covers, types of land cover, which are pervious and impervious, and each type of those cover represents those losses differently that I touched on earlier. So how much we lose to infiltration versus how much we would lose to the drainage network from that rainfall that falls. So there's some assumptions in there based on the type of land cover, but with the amount of data and the granularity of data available, we're now able to much more accurately depict that different land cover, which is a huge improvement as well. And again, another example, and this time this is in Glasgow, so a really urban area, but it's got a very, it's got lots of detail, lots of high resolution data available to it. And what you see in this kind of example is really flow pathways much more clearly now being picked up, particularly on steep streets. So yeah, another improvement to our product there. And I think really importantly for this audience and for users of the maps is the inclusion of small water courses. An example on the screen here is for our maps previously and now in the Carron Valley Reservoir area down in the central belt of Scotland. And I think the difference is really clear. All of those improvements that I've previously touched on, whether it's data, ground models, methodology, the rainfall information, they've all resulted in huge improvements to how we can represent the flood hazard associated with small water courses. So much so that we have renamed the product to not just be our surface water flood hazard map, it is our surface water and small water courses flood hazard map. So I think the difference is really clear, and I think from a planning perspective there'll be real value to be gathered from being able to understand those small water courses in a way that our previous maps just weren't able to support. Another, I think, a huge improvement, if I haven't laboured the point enough, is this publication of our future flood map, so our climate change map associated with our surface water and small water courses now. So the above example in the slide rather, that can be accessed from our Check an Area's Long-Term Flood Risk Service, which I'm sure many of you are users of and aware with. For planning, we know the future flood maps, they have a really important role to play in the delivery of NPF4, and obviously the considerations that climate change, come with that within planning. So this map can be accessed alongside all of our present day information. Also, it can be viewed alongside our future flood maps for river and coastal within this flood map viewer service. So there's lots of ways that you can interact with the data. And again, just to clarify, the data on our future flood map, that's for the 200-year event, and that's based on a 2070 central event on RCP 8.5. So a really big step forward, I hope you'll agree. It's worth sort of just highlighting, I suppose, that with any kind of national mapping, there is going to be simplifications and assumptions that we've had to make. And in some cases, this can lead us to have a bit more uncertainty in our mapped outputs than others. So it's fair to say the maps are imperfect, but we are certainly aware of some locations in particular that you might be interested in where you could expect some of this increased uncertainty. So in particular, you could expect to maybe encounter some increased uncertainty where our underlying digital terrain model or digital elevation models, where they're based on older or less accurate information. So where we don't have high resolution LiDAR that's been flown recently that captures on the ground changes that might have happened, anywhere that information doesn't exist, probably a bit less confident in the mapped outputs that we're producing in those locations. We can also expect to have a level of increased uncertainty, specifically when we've got small water courses in in wooded areas. That's quite a difficult thing for the mapping to represent in some cases. So it's often because that ground model isn't able to represent that small water course accurately, so our maps can struggle in those kind of circumstances. So small water courses in wooded areas are a bit of a potential area where our maps might not be completely as confident as we are in other areas. The maps can also have issues displaying particularly steep water courses, and that's shown in the example on the screen just now. There's a few sort of very bizarre looking straight lines happening that we wouldn't expect to see in flooding. They're at a strange diagonal angle. They're not really aligning very well with our background layer that shows where the map is visually, where the watercourse rather is visually. It's a fairly extreme example I've got here. This is from the area around Fort William, so a very, very steep part of the world where I told there's not a huge amount of planning interest, but it's very worthwhile being aware of that there are some things that the modelling will struggle to resolve, and that's an example of them. It's also important to note that, you know, despite all of these significant improvements we've made, which are, I hope you'll agree, vast, especially between our previous generation of maps and these new maps, they don't provide a site-specific assessment of risk to any individual property. That's also true of our river and our coastal flood maps too. We've assessed flood risk to areas in Scotland, not to individual properties, but the maps, the value and the strength, the power of the maps really lies in using them to screen, to identify areas at risk of flooding, if locations sit within areas at risk of flooding and should be subject to further assessment and consultation with SEPA and flooding colleagues. So there's huge value in them, despite in some circumstances, some areas that are difficult for us to represent within the modelling. Final slide from me, rattling through this at pace and covering lots of complex areas, so please do come with questions. It's just a bit of a recap, really. After 5 years of contract and tens of thousands of model simulations and a huge amount of hard work from the project team, consultees, reviewers, partners, agencies, there's a huge effort coming in there. The maps are finally been published and they're out there and in use, and they have been for the last several weeks. So a huge thanks to anybody on this call who's been involved in that, perhaps my reviewer end. I hope you've found that a useful process, and I hope the maps are useful to you now that they're out there and available. There's been various comms piece and briefing notes shared with this, and our social media campaign is well underway, so that's great. Keep an eye out for some familiar faces from this call on your social media channels, promoting the maps as well. We've also made some really important updates to that viewer that I talked about, that Check-in Areas Long-Term Flood Risk service. We've renamed it to Check-in Areas Long-Term Flood Risk. We've made some changes to the search radius and how information is presented to users of that service. And we've made some other specific improvements based on feedback from planning colleagues. We've made it easier, I hope, to find and view the future flood maps. We now have the future flood map. Again, I'll reiterate that point if it wasn't harder than enough. Also some changes to things like default transparency and a few other technical changes. So there's been improvements made in partnership with the maps to help the viewers where they are hosted be as usable for partners as possible. And we brought all of our maps up to version 3, including our river and coastal. So if you happen to be using local copies of those, consider downloading the latest versions. They're all just on version 3 now. There's not been changes to the actual content within the rivers and coastal, but we're all now on working to version 3. I'll hand over now to Claire, and she'll discuss the use of the maps within planning.
Thanks, Emma. Good afternoon, everyone. So Emma's given us a really good flavour there of all of the changes that have gone into the maps, and I hope that even if you weren't following all of the sort of technical ins and outs of DTMs and rainfall models, I think what we really hope that you'll take is that a lot of different aspects of what's gone into the maps have changed. There's no sort of one thing that makes these maps better than the other, but it's a composite of a lot of things that have updated it. And so what we're going to just concentrate on for the last little bit is how we should use them and what that means for us. Bear with me till I get the slides to catch up. So the first thing that I'm sharing here is just a copy of a table. We shared a briefing note a couple of weeks ago when we let you all know that the new flood maps have come out. We shared a briefing note, and this table was included in the note that just gives an overview of the different sources of flooding that are in the river flood maps and the surface water and small watercourse flood maps, and which maps the different sources of flooding are covered by. That's just for reference. If you didn't receive the briefing note, we'll share it again after this meeting for anybody who hasn't seen it yet. The key thing here to note is that there are some catchments that are bigger than 3 square kilometres but smaller than 10 square kilometres are covered by both the new maps that we've just published, but they're also on the river flood maps. So there are flood extents for those watercourses on the river flood maps. And in lots of areas, those two flood extents won't be the same. Now, generally, because of all of the reasons that Emma's just explained, generally speaking, the new maps are probably going to be a better representation of flood risk from those watercourses than the existing river maps are. But that isn't always the case. Emma covered there a few reasons why there's still a good bit of uncertainty in some of these maps. And so what we just really wanted to let you know is that if there is flooding shown on the river maps, but not on the newer maps, and there's any doubt about which you think is the best, then please just go ahead and consult us or check if you can with your in-house flooding folk first, who might also have a view on that. It might be that we don't have a view on which maps are better. Both the maps are still national scale mapping and still won't represent all the local detail. And so for those sites, it might be that the developer flood risk assessment is needed to establish what the most likely flood risk scenario is, and we can't tell from the maps. But that's just something to highlight to you where we've got watercourses that are covered both in the new maps and on the existing river maps. The other thing just to mention is those very small watercourses, the ones that are less than 3 squared kilometre catchment size. So those weren't mapped at all before, although sometimes in the existing surface water maps we did have a bit of indication of the risk. They weren't covered. So those are that's the really big improvement on small watercourses, is that those catchments are now included, and there's no lower limits for catchment size on those. So provided it's picked up in the digital terrain model that's used in the mapping, then it'll be picked up in the maps if it needs to be. So that's just what to say on that one. And the other thing that I wanted to cover is because these maps essentially show two sources of flooding. So they're showing the surface water flooding, so the direct flooding from heavy rain, but they're also showing that flooding from small watercourses. As you'll know, you don't consult us on surface water flooding. You can refer to standing advice on that, but you do consult us often on flooding from small watercourses. So the question really is, you know, is it easy to tell the difference? How can you tell the difference? So with the new maps, some of the flooding, hopefully you can see my cursor, lots of the flooding is like puddle shaped, and it'll be obvious from that it's surface water only. But you'll often see flow paths being picked up. So you're seeing a flow path here that's actually following a road. It looks a bit like a river. The flood extent looks a little bit like a river. But if we see the map on this side where the flood maps are switched off, you can see that there is actually no watercourse channel on that side. That is just following a road and then like overland flow. Whereas on this side, we're seeing a flood extent, which again looks like a river. And on this map, in the background mapping, you can see that there is a channel in that location. So that flooding would be associated with that small watercourse. So what we're saying is, if it's just surface water flooding and there's no watercourse, then you continue to refer to standing advice and deal with that however you would normally deal with surface water flooding for planning. If you think it's a small watercourse, then just check the background mapping to ensure that there is a channel that's associated with. It would be more difficult in areas where there are watercourses that are in long culverts, like in built up areas. That's where it's really useful to check with your local flooding teams for information about that, if you can, before consulting us. And I think Elaine will mention that again in a minute. So I think that's all I had to say. I'll just pass over to Elaine to finish off.
Thanks, Claire. Yeah, you'll be relieved to know I only have one slide, so we're making really good progress. I'm going to have plenty of time for questions. Yeah, so I am Elaine Fotheringham and I work in the planning and contaminated land here at SEPA. And my role is around supporting and coordinating the advice that we provide on land use planning through our role as a key agency and a statutory consultee. And obviously, given the audience that we've got here today, we know that planning users are a big component of the audience that we have for flood maps in Scotland. Obviously, they do play quite a significant role in terms of planning decision making. So Claire's covered some of this already, but essentially just to give a bit of a summary of what it means, or what this new map update means for consultation with SEPA on flooding. So as before for coastal, as Emma mentioned, the coastal aspects of version 3 of the maps haven't been updated. And coastal flood risk is covered by our triage guidance, which I think a lot of you will be familiar with. This is the framework that we've set out, which explains when we want to be consulted on flood risk consultations for planning. For surface water or for pluvial flooding, as Claire said again, obviously these maps are providing a much more enhanced picture of what that risk poses for Scotland, which should be helpful to local authorities. But as before, we don't expect consultation with SEPA where the risk is solely from surface water, and that is covered by our standing advice. And we can maybe share some of the links to these pieces of guidance afterwards, along with the briefing note that Claire mentioned. And for fluvial, again, so the key step here, or the key new aspect, is that the risk in future might be identified for fluvial risk on these new maps in a way that it wasn't pictured or captured in the surface water maps before. Claire's touched on this again, but just around checking for the presence of a channel when we're talking about fluvial risk on these maps, and also where it's available to you, seeking advice internally before consultation with SEPA. And I appreciate that's not the case, that the resources there are available everywhere, but where it is, we would recommend that that's done first before consultation with SEPA. And essentially for small watercourses, it's the same advice that we've been advising on up until now. The approach is the same, which is essentially to seek that in-house advice for small watercourses before you consult with us, albeit that before we didn't have those catchments under 3 kilometres squared captured on our maps. So the triage guidance, which I mentioned, is in the process of being updated, and we will look to, it's been updated in a couple of different respects, but we will look to update it specifically to capture the approach of these new maps and what it means for consultation with us. And we're hoping to have an update to that published in the next few months, ideally by early summer. So I'll just quickly, that's all from me in terms of the planning side.